Today I have Selena here with me, and we're going to be talking more about erosion. It's some of my favorite work. You know this, we talk about it all the time, that I was so excited about learning about rocks and soil and water that my first career was as a geologist and exploring these ideas. And so here we are talking about erosion by ice. We have already talked about erosion by rivers and rain and waves, and today we're going to talk about ice and glaciers. Are you ready? So a couple days ago, Selena and I told her we needed to get ready for a new experiment. And so we went and got a small glass jar. It was a jar, sorry about that. It was a jar that was had olives in it. It was one that our grandma had given us. She recycles her jars by giving them to us. And so it's a small olive jar. And we filled it up full of water and put the lid on it and stuck it in the freezer inside of a metal can. Just a little like flower pot can. And that was because I knew that something might happen. So when we went out just now to get our jar of water, glass jar of water, we noticed something had happened inside that can, and we want to share that with you. And it's going to be hard kind of to see on the two screens. I'll just hold it up to start. And there's some broken glass here, so I'm going to ask Selena not to touch it. That's why she's acting all weird, because I told her she wasn't allowed to touch it. And I want to show you what happened. This is just a normal jar. And you can see there's the lid is no longer on it because something happened up here. And you can see the cracks in the jar. I'm going to turn on the other screen. I don't know if it'll be any better, but you can see. So it's kind of hard to see. You can kind of see the cracks in the glass. See the cracks in the glass down here? I don't want to touch it too much because I'm worried it's going to break. But what happened, and you can see it's been sitting on the table getting ready for this lesson. Pieces of the glass actually broke off where the lid hooks on because the water inside changed. When the water inside this jar got cold, what happened? It turned into ice. When we talked about the states of matter, we talked about solids, liquids, and gases. We know that liquid water, when it gets cold, it freezes and becomes ice. And so this is showing us that when this water froze, when this water got cold, it expanded. You can see that it came out of the jar. It broke its way out of the jar, and it cracked the glass while doing it. And that's because when things get cold, especially water, when water turns from a liquid to a solid, the bonds that hold it together, you know how we talk, they're loose and things can pass. When it turns into a solid, those bonds, instead of doing this, do this. Can you pass through there? So you can't pass through there. Now it's a solid, but you see that now this solid has a shape. When water is liquid, it takes the shape of its container. But when liquid turns to solid, it has a shape of its own. And you can't pass through it. And if you notice, my hands take up more space than when the particles are moving between each other, right? This is firm and hard and taking up space. And so we can see, ooh, it's about to break more. I felt it when I was touching it. I don't want to get my finger in it, but the glass is about, there it goes. It was so cracked all the way through that this glass isn't even holding its shape anymore. I don't know if I can tip it up this high. It's better to see this way. So yes, now we have a cylinder of ice, but there's probably some glass pieces in there, so I don't want to touch it anymore either. So it's really interesting that this water, when placed in the freezer, turned to a solid, it burst its way out of the jar. Okay, I'm gonna slide that out of the way so that I can show you a chart. Actually, I have something to say first before I show you the chart. So when we're thinking about this, it's really quite interesting, I think, to think about water and how water, when it gets cold, it freezes, and when it freezes, it gets larger, it takes up more space. So I want you to think about places like here, like where we live in Spokane, but there's lots of places on Earth where rain falls. But when the rain falls during the spring and the summer and the fall, but in the winter, it's cold and it freezes. That water can freeze. So in those places where rain falls onto rocks and onto mountains and onto hills, the water flows into all those tiny crevices. But in places where it gets cold, the water that's in those crevices freezes. And just like it did to our glass jar, it expands and it breaks more cracks in rocks. Now, rocks are stronger than glass, and so it takes more time than just a couple nights in the freezer. And so after year after year, water fills in the cracks, it freezes and expands, the crack gets bigger, water fills the cracks, it freezes, gets bigger, and eventually the rocks break apart and form soil. And they form big rocks and boulders and pebbles and all the sorts of things. But that's primarily what makes up soil. So I do have a chart to share with you. So I will go back to the other view. So we can imagine that when it rains and the rain falls into the rocks and gets into all the tiny crevices and it just hides there. So it's like this little boy crawled down inside the rocks to hide. Now, in the winter, something happens. In the winter, it gets really cold. The water starts to freeze and turn to ice. And it's like what you see here. When the water freezes, it becomes solid, it expands, and it stretches out just like this little boy and breaks the rocks apart. The force of water expanding and stretching is so great that it breaks rocks. It breaks these rocks into little pieces, big pieces, boulders, and big rocks and little rocks, all the way down into the little bits of soil that you see. We call this process where the water gets into the cracks, freezes and breaks, more water gets in. We call this freeze thaw. It's freezing and then thawing, and then freezing and thawing. So if water got into this crack, put a little bit of water in there. So water got into this crack, and then it froze and it broke the crack bigger. Now more water can fit in, but then when that water freezes, it stretches and breaks it bigger, and then more water can fit in, and more water can fit in, and more water can fit in until it breaks off. And so that's what happens. It's freeze thaw. It freezes and then thaws, and then freezes and thaws, and freezes and breaks off. This is called erosion by ice. So soil is predominantly made up of broken up, eroded rock, and a main source of broken up rock is freeze thaw. Of course, this doesn't happen everywhere in the world because it doesn't freeze everywhere, but here where we live, it definitely does, and it is outside right now. Okay, would you like to know more about erosion? Okay, so we're going to talk more about erosion. We're going to talk more about erosion by ice, but in a slightly different way. So let me grab the chart. Hang on a second.